This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week, we're going to take a break from exclusively discussing affordable housing and talk about inclusivity and how inclusive mindsets can reduce divisiveness and isolation in our communities. This week's ChangeMaker is a longtime chairman of the Special Olympics, a best-selling author, a film producer, and a founding force of the social and emotional learning movement. His name is Tim Shriver. Dr. Shriver, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You serve as the board chairman of the Special Olympics. So let's start there. How did you decide you were going to join this path, advocating for inclusion through the joy of sports?
Well, honestly, I started as a teacher, and I started as a teacher because I felt that our country was facing a crisis. This is quite 30, 40 years ago, a crisis of injustice and intolerance and discrimination, where too many children were finding themselves on the other side of a wall that was separating them from opportunity, separating them from dignity, separating them from the chance to participate, not just in the economy, but in the civic and cultural life of our country. This is the 80s. Maybe people look back and think this was a golden time. But for me, the country was still living with the vestiges of discrimination and racism and injustice and grinding poverty. And so I thought teaching was a place I could go to empower young people, to help them find their strength and their passions and help them become agents of change, not just for themselves, but for others. And I did that work for quite some time, and I love it. And I think public education and schools generally are enormously important places where young people find their voice. If we do a good job as educators, young people find themselves, they find others who care and share their beliefs, they find purpose, they find a role in life, they find a way to make a living and make a life. That inspired me enormously. Special Olympics was a volunteer role for me, even in those days. And then there was a point in my career where I just all of a sudden realized that Special Olympics was teaching the lessons I thought were most important. Special Olympics was teaching people to meet across barriers. I thought that was so important. I could see it happening, even at like track meets. Special Olympics taught people to see people for their abilities, not for all the historic prejudices that exist. And people were coming out of institutions in those days and people were cheering for them. And I thought, my goodness, if we can do this for people with Down syndrome or autism, why can't we do it in our culture? And then I saw Special Olympics as a place where people celebrated each other, had fun, it was joyful. And I thought, wow, this is not a track meet. This is a classroom of the heart. This is a classroom of human capacity building. This is a classroom of human dignity. And so when the opportunity arose, I left the schools, but I didn't leave education, at least in the way I thought about it. I just went to a different classroom, and the classroom turned out to be the playing fields and swimming pools and mountains of 190 countries around the world, and it continues to inspire me every day.
I'm really enjoying learning more about the 50 game changers that you guys have on your video series on your website.
Yeah.
And I watched Loretta Claiborne's story. She's from York, Pennsylvania. She actually completed 26 marathons. She's won 6 gold medals and completed the Boston Marathon in 3 hours. And like you said, it was Special Olympics in high school that helped her realize that she had a talent, that she could run at these levels, and it gave her motivation and almost a way to combat some of that stigmas and bullying and challenges that she was having in high school. She wasn't even aware of her talent before Special Olympics. And now fast forward, she's given speeches at the United Nations and the Vatican. You must have a list of similar impacts that you could just fill a novel with. Are there any ones specifically or anyone's life specifically that you want to highlight for us? Because I think that really brings home this concept that you said, having human dignity and just overcoming those barriers.
Well, you're right. Loretta's an amazing story. So too is, we just lost a mom, for instance. This is not a Special Olympics athlete, but a mom, Tali Kornhauser from the country of Israel. Tali had a great husband, has healthy and happy children, one of whom happens to have an intellectual disability, Lynn. Tali changed her whole life. She's an artist, And she became an artist who brought the joy of art to people with intellectual disabilities all over the world. She's a peace builder. She learned this from her daughter, Lynn. And so in Israel, even in the most difficult times, she was always looking for ways to bring people together, Palestinians, Egyptians, Jordanians, even Syrians, and which is not easy in Israel. Tali became as proud of her daughter, Lynn, as she was of her other children. And she brought that energy to everyone she met. This is the story of a human being who faced what most people think is the worst possible outcome. A child who is different, a child who is going to struggle with some. Most parents are terrified of that. Tali all of a sudden was transformed. She no longer saw Lynn as the child who didn't fit in, but the child who taught her what it means to fit in and realized that everybody fits in. Tali lost a battle with cancer just a few weeks ago. But there's a mom, and this is a story of moms too. Mostly moms, I'm sorry to say. Some dads, but mostly moms. And moms know this, that, when you've got your child in your arms, that's what you're willing to spend your life fighting for. That's what you won't compromise for. That's what you will not give in for. And it is that kind of love that has transformed the world through Special Olympics. Now, I could go on with so many other athletes. I mean, so many athletes who have done extraordinary things. We just saw Chris Nikic a couple of weeks ago, the first person with Down syndrome ever complete the Ironman. I mean, you have to remind people. I had to be reminded, wait a minute, 2+ miles swim. Wait a second, really? 100+ mile bike ride. Wait a second, a full marathon after that.
Right.
Wait a minute, are you kidding me? A person with Down syndrome? Do you know what they used to say about people with Down syndrome? That they couldn't swim because of their body density, that they couldn't do sports because of joint weaknesses, they couldn't exercise because of weight problems. And Chris Nikic just completed the Ironman? Are you kidding me? Wait a minute. Who's complaining now? Wait a second. I call my kids, wait a second. Are you complaining about, an obstacle? Do you see the power of human grit and perseverance in this man whose motto is 1% better every day? Just 1%. He's got the wisdom that comes from deep spiritual traditions, that you don't try to change the world. You just try to do what you can today. And the grit and perseverance of the greatest sports champions who say, I will stop at nothing to cross the finish line in the best possible time I can possibly achieve. These heroes are around us. You know what I mean? They're moms, they're athletes. People say, well, look, I'm so great what Special Olympics did for Loretta. Born in the housing projects, born to a mom who'd suffered from racism her whole life, born with brothers and sisters who were coming in and out of the house and struggling to make ends meet her whole life, bullied, called a bozo, beaten up, thrown out of school. And then people say, well, but Special Olympics changed her life, and it did, but she changed the world through Special Olympics is the way Loretta has changed more lives than anyone could possibly have imagined, because when she stands up to speak, hearts open up and people automatically understand they're in the presence of a great soul, a soul infused with love and passionate about making a difference for others. Those are the gifts that make a difference in life. That's what matters most.
And you know what Loretta's doing is she's going into the classroom and she's talking to the youth. And, she's actually this divine continuum where she's going back to, youth who hurt her when she was growing up, not the same youth obviously, but, and she's talking to them about how they view their own value, how they view others' worth. And she's such an authority in this. It's just amazing because it's the message that is still needed with and without a disability, right? On That's ears. Right. I mean, like this message just is always timely. But I look at that. If she hadn't been aware, she hadn't been able to have that moment of getting incorporated into Special Olympics, would her path have come in that same method? We don't know. She had the talent, and Special Olympics was able to affirm who she was, and eventually lead to where she is now. And I'm a mother with children who have special needs. And in fact, one of my 10-year-olds, she has competed in Special Olympics and track and field. And at Quadell, we have several employees who have volunteered at the games or have personal associations with Special Olympics. And it doesn't take long for anybody who's been involved with your organization to walk into the stadium or walk onto the field or walk into the natatorium or wherever they are and just realize that this is a message for the world. This is a message to be able to bring a unified world and sports be the conduit. So I'm curious, what is it that you hear when people come and volunteer? What are they surprised by when they show up?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for that beautiful commentary. This sacred river, this your work as a mom, the volunteers that are there by you. Thank you to all of them for recognizing that none of us is living our lives in vain when we reach out to one another, when we treat each other with dignity, when we treat each other with respect, with love. We have made our stand that every life matters and that our lives will not have been lived. And, it may seem the world is in bad shape in some respects, and in some respects, of course, it is. But your kids, the words you just said, we just keep lighting our candles, right? And no matter how dark it gets, you just light a candle. And you may not know whether it's going to light the whole sky right away, but you can be sure, each one of us can be sure, in the darkness, light a candle. And you know that it'll light some space. So, I think, look, people come to the games. I go to the games. What happens? I'm shocked over and over again. I'm so surprised at how happy everyone is. This is a place where, as I said before, maybe this resonates some with you. Most people would say that's, I had a person, a big radio host years ago say to me, I said, well, why haven't you ever come to the games? You've done so many things for our organization. He says, it's too sad for me. I can't handle it. I said, no. You missed the point. This is the happiest place you're going to find on earth. And that shocks people. They expect to come in and see limitations and challenges and medical problems and all these kind of things. And instead they see smiles big enough to light up the sky. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? So the joy, my dad used to say we should call these, not instead of the Special Olympics, the Smiling Olympics. People come here and it's almost like you walk across the threshold of the gym door into a Special Olympics practice and you've entered into a sacred zone where there's no judgment. And what happens to people is they just almost instinctively, they just start smiling. They don't know what to make of it. Wait a minute. What is this? Where am I? What kind of a place is this where people aren't judging each other, where people aren't putting each other down, where people aren't sorting each other, where people aren't deciding who's worthy and who isn't? It's like you just want to smile, right? I even just talking about it makes me want to smile. I miss it so bad in these COVID times. So I think joy is a big discovery. Joy in the midst of what you thought. I mean, let's remember, most people come to the games assuming that the person with an intellectual challenge is sad, has less value, is a burden. These painful, painful words. They're just so painful. Sometimes I can't even say them. It feels too hard to me. And they come and they find, no, that's all wrong. You've read the book by the cover. Read the book from the inside out, and you'll see none of that is true.
Well, and if we could rewire our thinking, there's so many blinders about burdens and hardship, and you don't instinctually try to embrace those. I mean, I remember when I, delivered my child who had special needs, and the doctor came in and apologized in almost a grieving manner, and didn't say, yes, there's going to be some obstacles. However, there was no ... Yeah. They didn't come in and say, hey, there may be a genetic chromosome change, but that doesn't mean that they can't do fill in the blank. There was not that. It was like a grieving moment, and it set the stage for that doctor's own misconception
That's right.
of that child.
Yeah.
So and I'm sure internationally you see quite a difference in how people embrace other people with disability too. Sometimes we deceive ourselves here in the United States to think that, we have more access and we believe in inclusion, and, yet we still have much to do ourselves. But internationally, when you go into other countries, what are the obstacles that you guys are overcoming, or what is Special Olympics doing in some of those community spaces?
Well, I think, what we've found is a little bit, again, counterintuitive, like a lot of things with Special Olympics. You go to a lot of countries and people will say, I'll meet with leaders of a company or a governor or something like that, or a mayor. And they say, well, it's very nice what you're doing, but we don't have volunteers here. This is not a normal thing for our country. And I always just say, okay, but can we get started? And before you know it, we have more volunteers than we know what to do with. And people will say, well, in our country, it's a curse to have a child with an intellectual disability. The parents won't let their children come out to play. And just a few months ago, one of our colleagues said, well, in a refugee camp where we had found children were being hidden and even chained. And they said, well, can we just organize a track meet? And guess what? All the kids came out. All the mothers brought them out. So the human spirit is hungry for belonging, right? We're all looking for the same things. We all want to raise our children to be happy. We all want to feel that we belong. We all want to breathe clean air. We all want to feed our families and our bodies with nutritious food. We all want to be able to love one another and feel love back in return. We all want to matter. That has no limitation by country, by nationality. Some places it's tougher. Yes, it is tougher. The shame, the stigma, the burden is tough. But in this country too. I mean, right now we're in the midst of this COVID epidemic, and too many times people with intellectual disabilities are at the back of the line for treatment, for care, for vaccinations. Forgotten, because there's this subtle, maybe unconscious bias. Well, people, in the back of their heads, they're thinking, do they really need it? Yes is the answer. Everyone who has a pre-existing condition, everyone who's vulnerable, everyone who has an exceptional need. Yes, at the front of the line. We want them at the front of the line, not third, not fifth, not last, at the front.
Right. And we want to make sure that there's access to choice. And I think that's what's missing so many times, is that there's an assumption that, they don't have a choice. And so the access isn't even provided.
There you go.
So as a society, clearly we're still in a rather long incubation period of understanding and engaging and really accepting people with disabilities. I mean, like you mentioned, just 5, 6, 7 decades ago, institutionalism was really still heavily advocated by professionals to families raising disabled children.
Right. That's right.
But, we're hopeful that now appears to be a wave of integration and inclusion. And, Special Olympics is such an authority in this space of integration and inclusion. Tell us about Unite.us, your newly launched initiative.
Well, Unite.us, or Unite, is just an effort to take the lessons of the Special Olympics movement. We've noticed in young people, kids who are inclusive, we looked at them for years. What do they have that's distinctive? What are their qualities? Could we teach that? Could we teach inclusivity? We discovered that you actually can. Inclusivity actually has certain skills. People who are inclusive have high degrees of empathy. We can teach empathy. People who are inclusive have high degrees of moral courage. They're willing to stand up for people who are being bullied. We can teach moral courage. People who are inclusive have a very fundamental belief, and that is that everyone is equal. We can teach that. Our country teaches that, right? So with Unite.us, we said, well, if these are good qualities to teach kids, why don't we have these qualities in the country? Why don't we teach dignity through our media and through our politics? And people laughed, they kind of laugh at me. Are you kidding? Dignity in politics? That's a dogfight. That's a horrible place. Dignity on cable news, that all they show is contempt. One side hates the other just as much as the other side hates back. We have a culture of contempt, as one colleague said. And my view is, look, I learned this from Special Olympics athletes. The world may be telling you, no, you can't do it. You're not able, you don't have enough strength or power or money to change the culture. But Unite.us is already 300-400 of the world's most profound spiritual, political, cultural, musical, celebrity leaders on the record saying it's time we learn to unite, to be inclusive. We cannot continue to meet contempt with contempt, to meet hatred with hatred. So we're trying to build media, podcasts, shows, streamathons, maybe someday documentaries, and challenges to our political system to end contempt and hatred and replace it with the same values that Loretta Claiborne has taught me my whole life. Treat everybody equal, have the moral courage to stand up to bullies, show empathy, gain perspective from understanding and listening to others. That's what we're trying to do. It sounds maybe crazy, but we're trying.
So, I think, when I'm listening to this, I actually hear topics for people to incorporate, but it's on the individual level, but there's also this larger concept, employees, employers, organizations, it's structures, it's processes, it's just keeps expanding the more you were describing this. Any specific advice on how leaders can support inclusion and, specifically disability inclusion?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, the big frontiers for people with intellectual and developmental challenges is first to change our language. Let's get out of the language of defect, of weakness, of problem, of contempt. Let's replace it with the language of neurodiversity, my favorite word is diff-ability, different abilities. The diversity and equity and inclusion movements that are strengthening now every day in our country, in businesses and in communities, are fantastic. They should include people with intellectual and developmental disability. This is a group that has so often left out of those conversations. I talk all the time to people in HR departments at big companies. They say, well, we have diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. I said, do they include people with developmental challenges? Well, no, but they include women. They include people from LGBTQ groups. They include people who've suffered from racism and racial oppression. But I said, well, that's good. That's great. Fantastic. Essential. But could you add people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? 200,000 of them were locked up in prison 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we haven't solved this problem. So hiring and welcoming faith-based institutions can do more to welcome people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Schools can do more to promote social inclusion. People with disabilities can often be the teachers in school, not just the victims or the learners or the needy population, the teachers of ending bullying in schools. So there's a lot of ways in which we can get our political and our social and these are not partisan, by the way. Some people say, well, how are you going to do that when Republicans and Democrats don't get along? I said, because I could care less about Republicans and Democrats when it comes to dignity.
Right.
There's no separation on dignity. There's no separation on empathy. We can agree on these things. We don't have to live in a world of contempt for one another. We can hold each other accountable, but not in contempt. That's just not necessary. So I think this is a field that can also help create some common ground for our country at a time when we're really starving for it. And I would almost say the survival of our nation depends on whether we can solve some of these intractable problems together, not shrink from them, but also not descend into a vision that the only way to solve a big problem is to crush the other side. That just doesn't work.
Right. And part of us we want to be hopeful to say that it is time now for, the country and for people to actually recognize that this is going to be our country's strength if we can come to the table and really believe in inclusion more than, a concept or more than something that's on
Right.
paper, but that we can practically incorporate this. People with disabilities make up the largest minority group in America, and so often they're the least accounted for when it comes to
Yeah.
equal rights and
Yeah.
anti-discrimination.
Yeah. Still invisible too much, much, much too often.
You mentioned employment even, and I pulled some information and I was just shocked. It says that people with disabilities have an unemployment rate of 6 to 9%. And the unemployment rate for people without disabilities is around 3.6%. And so we're talking about a jobless rate for people with disabilities that's like nearly 2 or 3 times as high as the rate for those without a disability.
Yeah.
And in
Well,
real,
those numbers are actually, I hate to say it, but those are actually good numbers. I've seen, for instance, in the intellectual disability field, sometimes people will say the unemployment rate is up to 70 or 80% in terms of competitive employment. So, we're just scratching the surface of the gifts and contributions that these people can make in the workforce, and the urgency of demanding that they get given the chance to do jobs where they can perform very well and make a huge difference. Everybody is better off when people aren't excluded. It's just the way, no matter how much we think the opposite, it's just always true. We all are happier when each one is happier. So the more we can create and expand the circle of belonging, the better we are.
I love what you said there, the circle of belonging, and that it meets at such a core. I really believe in, why we are here and also why we're so different too. And specifically Special Olympics and, inclusion programs, they actually pull back the curtain on perception and they really shine a light on an individual's abilities. And this has so much messaging that can translate into, workforce, education, community contribution. It's almost kind of like we have this amazing potential here that only a few people have discovered.
Right, exactly.
Only a few
But
employees,
think
right?
about it. You're right, but think about it. Everyone's wrong. Turn on your TV tonight. Most Americans are looking, well, who can I find to make sense of the world? Who can I find that's going to get us out of this mess? I don't care which side you're on political things. Who's going to show us what we can do here to heal all these problems? And sometimes it's right in our house, right in our school. A
So
lot of times our athletes are the best teachers of the way forward. And, it doesn't come in a rule book, but it comes from a heart of gold. And that's what I think
right.
a lot of us need.
Right. And, we all know, I mean, whether it is, the Dalai Lama or, whatever,
Hmm.
whomever you're, listening to, there are pieces that are universal that say if you give of yourself, and what you get back in return and
Yes.
the learning and everything. So there is this universal principle that I don't think that we have, we just haven't discovered this yet as a nation, really.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's people talk, in all these different great spiritual traditions about giving is receiving. I can't tell you how many millions of times I've heard that from Special Olympics volunteers. I went
Yep.
to serve, but I got back more than I gave. And I
Yep.
ask people over and over again, what did you get back? And they tell me the most beautiful stories of discovering the best in themselves, of seeing for the first time the possibilities of human generosity, of rediscovering what made them become a doctor or a teacher, the love and compassion they have for others, having it re-inspired in them. People go to those games, and they go to line the field or to serve water or to be an announcer or to help with parking or to any number of thousands of jobs, take pictures, write stories, clean up, empty garbage cans. They go to help. But what they get back, oh my goodness, giving is receiving. And you get back your best self.
So tell us more about your New York Times bestseller. The title was Fully Alive, Discovering What Matters Most. Is that what we're talking about here? Is that what your book covers?
The book was my attempt to tell the story of how the Special Olympics movement is, in effect, a classroom of the heart. So a lot of people who loved it and responded to it positively, to whom I'm very grateful, saw it as a book about disability. And it was. It was a history of the person with an intellectual disability in my own family, my Aunt Rosemary. It was the story of my mother, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who founded the Special Olympics movement, my uncle, President Kennedy, who helped launch public policy changes in the field of intellectual and developmental disability. But it was really my attempt to tell the story of how these athletes, Loretta, and Daniel Thompson, and all these other athletes, how they've changed me. So it's really, I hope for people, a way of seeing the world differently. If you're looking to find a way to see the world with less fear and less anxiety, I think the book helps. It will tell you stories that will refresh your spirit, and I hope lead you to believe once again in the goodness of the human spirit. That's what it's about. It's a story of the goodness of the human spirit and how it comes in places you can't possibly anticipate, in ways that will change your life. And that's what Special Olympics has been for me. It's changed my life. I think made me a more peaceful, a more decent, and certainly, in some ways, most ultimately, a more free person. I hope freer to be who I am, right? That's the gift that, in my view, God has given to each of us. The gift to be uniquely who you are. And this movement is all about unleashing that gift for each of us. And certainly it's been that way for me.
Well, just listening to you talk right now, I want to go out and, read the book, and I want to volunteer, and I want to tell everybody to volunteer.
Thank you.
But there's also more than that, too. So what would you tell people who believe in inclusion conceptually, but they just don't know where to start practically?
It's a great question. Obviously it depends a little bit on where you are in life. If you're working in a school system, there's ways to promote social inclusion there. If you're working in the medical field, there are ways to promote justice there. But I think the first step is what I'd call the respect step. Respect is a word that we use a lot, but it really means to look twice, to relook, to look a second time. And I just invite people, when you see someone who you're scared of, maybe someone who doesn't come from the same background as you, someone you've been led to believe has different values than yours, someone who you think is a threat to you, try the respect strategy. Just look a second time. Take that pause, that moment in which you suspend your first reaction, all those labels that come pouring into your head, let them go just for a moment and try to look again. And when you do that, and when I've learned to do that from my teachers, the athletes of Special Olympics, who have done that to me, who have looked a second time at me and seen something in me that sometimes I had no idea could have possibly have been there, we start to see each other just a little bit more deeply, So each of us, if we're in a corner suite of an organization, we can help with hiring. If we're the principal of a school, we can help with promoting social inclusion. If we're the doctor in the medical facility, we can make sure that we treat people with intellectual disabilities and don't turn them away. Whatever little things we can do, but whoever you are and wherever you are, you can take that second look when you see a person with Down syndrome or autism or other forms of difference that animate and create the human diversity and the human beauty of our family. Look twice, pause, just long enough to look from the inside out. And I think almost invariably you'll see something that will refresh your soul because it'll be beautiful.
Well, Dr. Shriver, I am so thrilled to have had you on this podcast. And, we've been going over ChangeMakers is our tagline, if you will, for this podcast. And we've really been focusing on affordable housing. And when we wanted to have you on this, we kind of said, this is such a swerve in the affordable housing space. But then we just all realized that your messaging here and your passion and your words of wisdom, they apply to so many different avenues, not just affordable housing. And so we really wanted to have you specifically on here. And, your work as a disability rights activist is so crucial right now, really maybe even more so than ever before as we, emerge here as a country. And I appreciate the time and everything you are doing on a daily basis. I'm glad that your passion has led you to this point.
Thank you. And I think that, this is where people, all of us, whether we count ourselves as Americans or from another country, some people will pick the path of affordable housing, others education, others healthcare, others transportation, others food, nutrition. The ways in which we can give back to the world are in the billions. Everybody wants, at some level, to join in that work. And I think the only thing we need to know and remember is that all of us have the same ultimate goal, to protect and to preserve and to honor the dignity of every human being equally. And if someone doesn't have a roof over their head, those words are shallow unless we put a roof over. And if someone can't go to a school, it's not enough to say, I believe in dignity. I believe in universal value. I believe in the sacredness of every human life. It's not enough to say it. You got to do it. We got to love it. As Mother Teresa said, love is action. So I'm thrilled, honored that we're included in the action agenda of affordable housing, because I don't think there's any separation between us when it comes to what matters most.
So well said. We agree wholeheartedly. Thank you to you and your team, and you guys keep pressing on. And many of us are in this space as well. And so, we're all in this together.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll be back on the playing fields very, very soon, able to celebrate and refresh our commitment to a more just and a more peaceful future.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.